Recording in
Go ahead and call the
progress.
meeting to order. We'll start with a roll call. McKee here, Schultz
Here.
Lodeman.
I'm not answering that question
Okay.
anymore. It's evident that I'm here.
Cam.
Here.
It'll be the
Nichols.
last
So
time I even comment.
so is John. How's that?
We're 5 for 5. That works. All right, we'll get into the main topic, or the only topic tonight, which is goal setting for 2024.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. In the packet that we sent you, starting out, the documents that we have are historic documents from previous strategic planning sessions, in which the mission, vision, and values for the city of Corcoran were established. I believe that they were officially adopted March 11th of 2021. So if you want to read those.
We've read them before.
No change from
We
mine.
already read them.
No change.
We designed this.
At the bottom of it, there are 5 core strategies. While they're listed there, I'm going to transition to, this is the way that the 5 core strategies were broken down after last year's session, with some of the subcategories in terms of the short-term goals, which then translated into measurables. Like I said, 5 core strategies, and between 2 and 4 sub
Thank you.
goals for each. And then I will transition to this chart, which actually breaks them down. And so what I'd like to do is have a conversation. We've got staff here to provide an update. The last update that was provided to you all was in September of 2022. And so looking at the first core strategy of enhancing Corcoran's sense of place and identity, there were 3 strategic objectives: engage residents through proactive outreach and communication, provide and or support high quality community events for community gathering, identify and develop a place where people identify with Corcoran. The short-term goal identified for 2023 was to identify and plan city trail corridors, including road trail plans, and then providing input and direction for the Parks and Trails Planning Commission. The measurable goal was to develop or create a map of existing trails. The short-term goal of identifying and planning city trail corridors, there's been a lot of progress in the last year. We've had discussions about that in terms of some of the trails in collaborative partnership with 3 Rivers and with Hennepin County, as well as some of our internal plans for trails. But the map that captures all of that does not yet exist. So any questions or comments about that core strategy, or any desire to add any short-term goals or measurables?
I think one area we could look at, strategic objective 3 under that category, identifying and developing a place people identify with Corcoran. We've had a couple projects that we've discussed over the past year that I think fit that relatively well. One of them is developing the Bellwether Open Space Park and that boardwalk across the wetland to connect it to the rest of that development, as well as the Bellwether Park itself. There's a lot of residents moving into that area, so it's a place where there's a good opportunity to have something that's unique to Corcoran that you wouldn't see in other cities, that we also have existing plans sort of laying the skeleton for. There might be some good measurables we can add for 2024 around that, like the construction of the boardwalk, the development of an official park plan that we would budget for in 2025, perhaps.
Potentially. That's good. Just kind of thinking off the cuff.
Are you asking that we add that to 2024? Or are you asking that we include that in our planning objectives? Or think about it?
I think
Or
we
is that
should
a
think about
specific
it.
request?
It's not a specific request at this time, no.
Yeah, I think I don't know exactly where to draw that line, but I think making some progress with the boardwalk and, getting it built would be fantastic. I think there's some of the details that need to get hashed out. So I'm not entirely sure what that measurable should be, but in some way making progress.
Well, we set the measurable and then it gets hashed out.
Are you asking to set the measurable?
I think I'm asking for us to discuss if we agree it should be a measurable. And if it should be, then we should execute on it.
If I could provide some feedback from the Parks and Rec Commission, they align with several of the things that you commented on. One was continue the work on the Diamond Lake Regional Trail, which will continue. The boardwalk in Bellwether was identified as a priority. The city park master plan, as you're trying to create the spaces. Wayfinding is, I think, the only thing that deviates from what you said. Starting to develop a wayfinding plan so that as we have these trails and as we develop these spaces, people understand how to get through them and what's expected of them as they go into those spaces. And then the idea of developing park standards or updating park standards. Those were the only things that were different when you talk about a place where people identify with Corcoran from the Parks Commission. Those were the only other comments.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is if it's a Diamond Lake Trail and it is a non-Corcoran project, why would that be number one on our priority when it's somebody else's deal? So the question is, it's a big deal. It's a priority deal. But it's not our deal. And it's like if I-94 was putting in 5 lanes instead of 3, it wouldn't be a Corcoran goal for the year is to put a 3rd lane on 94. Why is Three Rivers Parks Trail through our town our number one goal when it's sort of another entity's project? Why wouldn't we have our own projects that we can control and do be a higher priority on our own Park and Trails Commission?
To clarify, I don't believe that was in priority order. I think it was just the way that they came out. I don't think that was the way that they wanted them to be weighted. It was just the way that I read them. So
I don't think there's actually a project that they would advocate that we undertake. I think it's keeping it top of mind so that as proposals come in that might be routes for it, we prioritize making sure that we're making adequate space and the right kind of space for the trail. But you're right, John. It's not something that we can proactively execute. It's opportunistic. If there's a chance to improve it or extend it, we should try to do it in a high-quality way.
Sure.
Where do we sit with the open park, the open space park on Ravinia? I mean, that development is basically done, and that park is not anywhere near.
We did talk about that at the last Parks and Trails Commission meeting. So I don't know if you can bring up a map, Michelle, to show like the satellite view of that park. One of the things that the chair discussed was there's not really good access and parking for people to be able to use it. But it does connect to the trails in Ravinia. It does connect to the old Sturbridge neighborhood. You could conceivably develop some kind of a trail network in that park. There just wouldn't be an easy way to access it until something else develops. Like along the northern edge, you could try to put in a parking area so people can get to it and access it directly. But we did talk about that as something we wanted to try to focus on, is how do we take these open space parks from land that the city owns but hasn't done anything with and make them usable and useful.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's an expectation that that's part of a PUD, right? When the development is complete, that the park should kind of align with that point and not 20 years after the fact. So I would think that would be high on a priority list for Parks and Trail development.
Looking at that, I see where you're talking about access being an issue. Because even the Ravinia roads don't really, no Ravinia road is stubbed to it.
No, isn't there parking along Annabelle Lane for it?
There's street parking, but it's not like there's a carve out or a significant number of spaces. That doesn't mean you want to develop it.
Right.
So like,
Trail there.
sorry, I'm pointing it at
Just
myself.
go to the west a little bit.
There's a trail
Yeah,
right
It's not-
here.
Go to the west. right?
that just
One more
dead
over,
ends.
3 lots over.
Yeah, it goes back to that, it goes back almost to the property line.
Yeah.
Stops.
It's that, yeah, right between those houses is where it goes. This is an old aerial.
Yeah, so you could certainly have people, parking along the residential street and then walking in or biking in. There's probably a lot of people who would use it just from the neighborhood if it were,
Oh, I'm sure,
Connected to
I'm sure it
something.
would get a lot of use from the neighborhood. I mean, there'll be concerns from Old Sturbridge neighborhood about people coming into their neighborhood to access it.
They'd be able to access it.
They'd be able to access it. I mean, maybe it's something we develop and we put no parking signs up in that area,
Yeah.
for a while.
Because if you do that, then suddenly you get, people in Tavera can get across once Hackamore Trail's there and Diamond Lake potentially. Then you can work your way up through Open Space Park there, then you're getting relatively far north, you hit Diamond Lake again, up to City Park.
Right, because, I mean, what are we gonna do? Wait for Shamrock to develop into a residential area before we can actually develop the park just to have parking?
I think we can certainly develop it now. I would support that wholeheartedly. I think it would be great for us to have as a standard expectation, if we're going to plan for a park as part of a neighborhood, we shouldn't wait for that development to be done before the park goes in. That should be a year 1, year 2 kind of activity.
Right. I think we at least to have forward thinking to know how it comes to resolution before it terminates.
We were talking too, I've spoken with some of you about the timing of when to put trails in. And those opportunities when we can have developers put trails in before the housing is built is advantageous on multiple fronts. But the biggest one, when we've had conversation about, not in my backyard, I experienced this in Shakopee, in which people knew when they bought the property that there was an easement for a trail to go in. And then over years they encroached because the trail never came in. They knew that it might come in. And then now we had a huge challenge trying to pull back those encroachments, everything from fish ponds, koi ponds to buildings, storage facilities, because the trail wasn't put in at the front end.
It's sort of like what we got on the
Happening in
northeast
Belleville.
side of town already.
Correct.
Let's not do that.
If we can encourage developers to put them in while it's being built, or even better, before the majority of it's built, it also casts a vision for people's expectations of what's going to happen with this space. And I agree, when we can have developers build part of the park or partner with it, that helps them sell the spaces, but it also helps us in terms of the timeline for development, so we don't have the things that you're talking about.
Can we put that in a contingency of a application approval, is that they put the park in first legally?
Application.
I think for
First,
PUD
but as
you
part of
could.
the process, we
Yeah.
can make it part of the PUD process. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've been part of more discussions than I have.
That way, if they walk away, we still got a nice
I
park.
think it might be a little bit, because each development is specific in how it weaves through, but I think with the PUD, you have more of an opportunity to try to have a conversation about the timing of parks and what commitments go into parks, but park dedication is really handled by planning and it's a little complicated, so I
Sorry
don't
to
want
put
to
you on the spot.
overpromise anything, but it's certainly worth a comment, because what I'm hearing tonight and what Jay's saying is different than when I first started 6 years ago. So I think it's important to have a policy decision, because when I started 6 years ago, it was, let's wait for the people to move in and then talk about parks. If you guys, if the council feels like that's not working out, or want to try something different, that's a shift in what how we've approached developments when developers come in, so that would be really important for staff to know, for us to, when we meet with developers, that, hey, this is a shift in how we've approached parks and systems and trails, so that is something that should be clearly, I guess, advised to staff if we want to kind of switch our approach.
To not make everybody feel badly, I think what's happened has been evident that we want these parks in these places, but now we're running into places like Bellwether where there's some people that don't want a boardwalk. They don't want other neighbors walking through, or that open space park in Bellwether. They don't want it there. I mean, it's even goes to the well and the the water tower that was supposed to be and is planned, and they all signed for it. In a place like this, where I'm hearing everybody talking about parking lots, I don't want a parking lot for a neighborhood walkway or park. There should be a trail through and it's walkable to it, not people driving from Ravinia into and park and then walk it and then get in their car and go back home. I thought these neighborhood parks were more neighborhood than a destination park where anybody in the city can come to it,
And
if you know what I
maybe
mean.
we'll run into that being an issue less once we have some of our other, we have City Park
Right.
done and there's.
I mean,
other
city
destination
park, I
parks.
can see that being, but these,
Right.
while yes, they're city parks, they're part of a neighborhood
Right. They're like
and
destination-y.
I
Well, we
don't,
can't
I don't
use-
wanna turn
we
into
can't
a
use
destination.
Citywide funds and then make them exclusive to a neighborhood.
And I'm not wanting to do that either, I just, how big a parking lot are we looking at
Right.
to put next to a trail?
To incentivize
Is it-
it being a
To build on
destination.
the things that have been said here, one of the things that the Parks Commission did ask for was an opportunity to revisit and to clarify, develop park standards, update them, which I think ties to all of these conversations. The timing of it, how it goes in with planning, if it triggers any policy changes. That might be a really good way to get to the heart of all of these different issues, is to make that a goal for the next year, for the Parks Commission to work towards developing or updating development park standards.
Or even something where there's a actual path that goes from that stubbed area up over to, what was it, Staybridge? Is that what we're
Old
doing?
Sturbridge.
If there's the main trail and then auxiliary trails off of that into the woods and all of those things or something at a later date, but at least there's a trail there, not a stub trail to nowhere. And then everybody's back to, not in my backyard because,
And even if some of them were like what we talked about in that Karanimi property, where it's kind of like, it wasn't even mulched, it was,
Just mown grass.
yeah.
but something to that effect that, and there can be markers identifying city park trail, something, and then the evolution of it afterwards.
Right.
It's still there before somebody can start saying, I didn't sign up for that to go there. I don't want all this auxiliary traffic. I don't want all of this.
Yeah.
Don't people get adequate, hey, you're moving here, you should be aware of all this other stuff?
I think they do, but if you go to the Bellwether side, everyone there signed documents stating that
I
that's
get
a
it.
neighborhood park.
Yeah,
Everyone there had documents stating that there would be a well at this park and a water tower, and we spent how much to move the water tower out of there? I just,
no, I get it.
I think what this highlights and other things that we've seen is that, when these developments first went in, we had no experience. We tried
Well, yes.
making assumptions and based on the experience of planners and other communities, but from our experience over the last, almost 10 years, we realized things that we should have done better. This highlights it, the crosswalks highlighted it, the water tower, like you mentioned, those things, they're all things that we should learn from and make sure that we address them in the coming years so that
Right.
we don't make these mistakes in the future.
And how important timing is.
Right.
How timing matters. So I did go out and meet with some residents that were concerned about the Bellwether Trail. And from their perspective, they understood a trail was going to be there, but when they bought their home, they didn't have a deck on it yet. The deck took it that much closer. They didn't really have a vision for how close it was going to be. So now they're understandably concerned. And as I said to them, like, okay, you understood what it was, but actually seeing it, like I said, if the trail's there, when you go to buy your house, you have a very different feeling about it than with it's going to come someday. And now it's coming and my space has changed in a way. I've had lots of those conversations about that encroachment because is it ever really going to come? I've changed my vision of what can happen and what's possible, and now that it's come to roost, I'm not happy about having to give up what I grow to treasure, like my back deck.
previous administrations, I don't think they're mistakes. I just think it's learning,
No, yeah, we
understanding
just
the
have the
timeline. The
knowledge, right?
timeline needs
Yeah.
to be set. we need to put the priorities in and what's going on. I don't wanna hash out that everybody thought poorly.
Well-
I think it's all great ideas, it's time, you gotta put the horse before the cart.
Do you ever think to tell them they should have moved to the country if they wanted a bigger backyard?
Well, they did move to
some
the
point,
country, they
like-
moved to Corcoran.
I get
Is
it.
what I get from a
Yeah,
lot of
but-
them.
Okay, but know what you're buying sometimes. We can't insulate everybody from everything too.
Well, I think,
I don't want to design parks just for the fact that some residents don't pay attention and buy houses where a park is gonna be. Like, that's not, how many times do we have to backfill and say, oh, sorry, Mr. Resident, we should have told you that Anderson Trucking was gonna be there 2 years ago, you know? At some point, we have to do what's best for the city, and it may, I don't wanna do backflips to prevent an owner from, or to prevent an owner from not knowing what they should have known in the first place. I don't wanna I don't wanna go have the pendulum swing so far that we do a mistake by kowtowing to people who just don't pay attention.
I think there's a financial piece of it though too, where if we're collecting park dedication funds with the intent of putting in a neighborhood park or open space park, and we don't get to it for a decade, the purchasing power of that $500,000 from whatever that development was is a lot less when we actually get around to making the improvement.
But we haven't waited a decade on any projects.
It's getting close for some of Ravinia.
Yeah.
Is it? I guess
Yeah,
I've been on
probably.
council.
First Ravinia was 2013 and it's 2024.
And there are no parks. What about?
Well,
this
I
is-
was,
Well,
I'm just saying, it's a decade since Ravinia broke ground.
well, and I think some of the discussion early on, during the early Ravinia phase and talking about when the park planning was happening, we didn't have the staff as a city to do it, but I think it was also a community engagement that what could be more, bring a community together more than being able to help plan what that park looks like. And I don't think we ever contemplated the fact people might all of a sudden later not want the park or the trail. I think it seemed like the assumption was, it seems like a value add later, and instead you're changing people's reality. And so I think it's just more, like you all alluded to, it's changing circumstances, but it's also learning that at the time that seemed like a really good thing to let the communities help build what their space looks like.
Yeah.
And now you're finding less.
I think we need to hold the builder's feet to the fire at times and too, and say, you need to let people know and have their expectations. Because we always end up battling these things that we shouldn't have
Developers
anything to do
problem.
with.
Agreed.
So with the core strategy of developing a sense of place and identity and going to the strategic objective of a place where people identify with Corcoran, I hear that there's a desire to clarify some of the expectations and standards, both for development and planning. The commission seems like the right place for that to be in order to bring that to council. Do I hear that correctly?
I think it'd be good on the park side to get an updated draft to council, maybe by the end of first quarter. And then they can use that to plan
Timing and everything.
some specific improvements.
And we have the consultant now that could help with, the parks consultant that can help with what's maybe feasible with some of that stuff.
And if I could add, I don't want to build this, but we've got some things that are happening and then capturing it. So we got a, coming back, we've mentioned City Park, we've mentioned Bellwether Park, and then now this open space. I think we have to come back with a report on where we're at with the development of each of those parks. So we have a plan with HKGI for City Park. That will be very easy to report on here with that contract. But understanding prioritization, like right now, that's the key priority, because we have received some funding that we have to start spending.
Yep.
And then to the point, we also have received some funding from developers for some of these other spaces that we can probably start moving on some, but with limited capacity, probably one with a little bit of progress on another is reasonable. Is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my fear with this too is that, we didn't develop this because we didn't have park dedication funds to really do anything with it. Now we've got a lot more park dedication, but they're being directed more towards city park. So,
Well, we're gonna know a lot more here in potentially a month with, we get the federal funding request we have out for City Park. That will kind of define and we'd be able to make the numbers work on City Park, really with park dedication as is if we got that full funding. Then we'd have extra park dedication or more park dedication that we could allocate directly to this and to Bellwether, Boardwalk. I think pretty close to, with stuff that's in the pipeline with Tavera, next phase is coming in, and a couple other projects that are likely to come in the next year. I think we'd be able to get there, so we'll know based on if we get that federal funding in January. I think it's the
Okay.
19th is when they're supposed to vote on it.
because I think this isn't gonna be cheap to develop, even with just,
Yeah.
even with wood chip trails if you do it, because you're gonna have to bring engineering and surveying in place and so.
Yeah, maybe we should, probably should do an update of park dedication and if we get that federal funding, how that all breaks down. So,
Are we only talking about under the guise of enhancing Corcoran's sense of place and identity? Are we only talking about parks right now, or can we add other things?
can be other things.
Are we like spitballing stuff?
Sure.
So, did you guys get the email? Who got the email when it, about, from Met Council about the, was it just us that had a conversation?
Yeah.
So we got an email from Met Council this week about, can I bring it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Got an email from them that we asked for specific language that said that, two things. One is that the density requirements for Corcoran begin and only include development from when Corcoran signed up to be part of the Met Council's city sewer.
Plat. Yeah.
Sewer, so we had to have 3 per. The other thing that we asked for in writing is that we can bank, essentially that so long as the density of Corcoran is 3 per acre, that we could bank higher density areas against lower density areas
We'd have to make some
for development.
internal changes like the code, but yeah.
Yeah, and so like, they gave us the architecture and said, yeah, so long as you have 3 per, we're okay how you do it. And I asked the example, I said, so if we built a 10-story apartment and had 10,000 or 1,000 units in this 10-story apartment, could we have like 3-acre lots for the rest of Corcoran and still be okay if we're even in the MUSA? And this isn't what we got in the email or the actual on letterhead, but they said, yeah, so long as it met certain requirements, and I used it as an extreme example of like, can we have it be super dense in one area to give us flexibility in other areas? And we've had lots of conversation in city council about how to get less dense and how not to have every neighborhood look exactly like all the ones in Corcoran. And I thought this is one way to do it, is to have, so long as we're getting requests for higher density areas, can we use those to offset other areas with lower density expectations? And we got a yes, but then we requested that it's on Met Council letterhead, so like it's for real.
A little more tempered.
Yeah, and then, when that come, like Tuesday? Like it's fresh. This is
Yeah,
fresh
recently.
for us.
Yeah.
December 26th.
Yeah, so part of our conversation, I think that this has been a conversation around parks, but it also should, so parks are one piece of how we enhance Corcoran's sense of place and identity. So parks is one, like we could in theory have, if this is, how many acres is this little piece? I know this is earmarked for a park.
Really?
30, almost 39.
39 acres. So let's pretend this is a fresh parcel. In theory, if we just built a parcel next door, I think that's a 40-acre parcel square on the right. If we put 6 per on that 40-acre parcel, we in theory could have one house, if it's inside the MUSA, on the left-hand parcel, and the rest be park or whatever. What we were granted with these meetings is the ability to be flexible on our standards when it comes to housing and density. And with the less density requirements, we can have parks be a bigger part of our footprint, which I think to me is awesome. So in the first thing, enhancing Corcoran's sense of identity, sense of place and identity, I really think we ought to spend a lot of time on figuring out how we want to develop and how we want to use the higher density areas against areas that we want lower density areas. We've talked about it, and we always get stuck on the 3 per. We don't have to get stuck on the 3 per because not every development has to be 3 per. But it might take some redesign of density requirements, like for example, our low density requirements are like, do they start at 1 or do they start at 3? It's like 3 to 5.
3 to 5.
Yeah. But we don't have to have it, we don't have the in a
Right.
low density area, we
Medina's-
don't have
Medina's
to
is
have.
2.5.
Yeah, we can have the minimum density be a half
Right.
if we want it.
If we balance it out.
Yeah, so if we have an apartment building with a bunch of stuff, or a bunch of housing, we can have our low density or legacy, I can't remember what you used as an adjective, Jay.
Existing residential.
Existing or something.
Yeah, it was the first one, existing residential, which was 1,677.
Yeah,
And just changing that to say existing residential and low density.
yeah.
Or extremely low density.
So like within the parks discussion, like open space, like it doesn't have to be a park, it can just be an area where nothing exists. So I think it's so new, it was a week, but we've been working on it for a long time, how we make Corcoran different than Maple Grove, and it's huge. And
think
it's
it-
on their letterhead, and now it's official, and we gotta figure out how to use it.
I think it dovetails really nicely into the open space portions we added to the PUD ordinance.
It does, for sure.
It's exciting to see that, so thank you all who have been part of that conversation for driving it to that point. I agree, we need to have conversations about how we use that new feature available to us. I think instead of our limiting factor being Met Council says it has to be 3, the new limiting factor is probably going to relate to our ability to sustain our infrastructure in very low density areas. I don't know if it makes sense to do it at a half, maybe it makes sense to do it at 2.5 or 2, but
Yeah.
certainly lower than 3 would make sense.
We don't have to have them be like
Yeah.
down there.
I think we'll start to get a sense on what those numbers can be once some of the first multifamily actually comes in. Some of those sites that that we've seen either sketch plans or preliminary of, once one of those actually gets built, we'll have a sense of what the density is there and can probably more easily play with the numbers and see what we could make work elsewhere.
We'll get a good dose of what that could look like from the Hope project.
Yeah.
But we don't have to have like the builders dictate. Builders sometimes say, well, you gotta have 3 per and whatever. Like, we don't have to have the builders dictate what our town looks like.
No.
And that's refreshing and different. And invigorating, in my opinion.
If I can make a recommendation to build on that, one of the things we've also spoken about and one of the planning commissions asked, they've got some new commissioners, is to gain a better understanding of the comprehensive plan and the Met Council. The Met Council is going to roll out as part of their 2050 plan some training and information and stuff here in the next year to 18 months that's going to be focused on comp plan. But I think having them come and talk about how the Met Council works. So this was one step that really shed some light on how density calculations impact us. There might be some other variables in the equation with Met Council that would be good for both the Planning Commission and for the council to be apprised of. And so we reached out to them and asked them about the potential and coming and teaching a joint session like a Met Council 101. Would that be a reasonable, measurable that starts building on the information that we got, but then also potentially rounds it out with some other things that might not be related to density, but could impact some of our discussions and decision-making for both policies and planning for the future? Is that of interest?
I think so, and I think a joint session with probably both commissions at some point would be helpful, even separate from that council stuff, just having a joint session with the commissions on planning on density issues and stuff like that, like we've just been talking about in parks and trails, all the stuff we were just talking about before. So I think we've done that in the past couple of years for the most part, I think, right? We've done either one joint session with everyone, which maybe is a little bit too much.
But not specifically to the Met Council stuff.
No, just with the two commissions.
Whatever happens, the Met Council is not God. So like, whatever they say has to happen, or they recommend, I have a hesitancy of bringing them in and saying, and having them have the floor and tell us what to do, because we actually don't have to do what they tell us we have to do. And then part of me thinks we shouldn't even do a 2050 plan and just tell them to go fly a kite. With respectfully considering your idea, if they come in and speak, I think it's got to have a caveat, the giant caveat of we got to put our, like I tell my kids all the time, use your own brain.
Here's some baseline information, now we got to think about it.
Yes, you don't have to do what they say.
Right.
I think our discussion with Met Council goes exactly into what you're saying. Like knowledge is power. They came in and they said some things. We asked some hard questions. We pressed them for information. They provided the information, and now we have a better insight of what's possible. If we hadn't had that sit down, we'd still be here wondering.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
And so I think the opportunity to sit down with them, hear what they have to say, then we can decide how we want to respond what's been said, rather than speculate. That there's an advantage in us having a better understanding what they said. And as you press them, like, hey, you said this, I want to make sure I understand this, and will you put it on letterhead? Now that clarifies opportunities for the future for us.
Yeah. I think maybe if we did it, we should make sure that it's a date that works where John and Mark Lanterman and myself can all be there. Just and you, because we're all in there. So yeah, finding a date that works for that. But I think other than that,
Is that a first step that satisfies your desire to move in the direction that you were talking about related to the Met Council? I heard some of what you're saying, but I'm also trying to think about competing demands with other things that we have. What's a measurable that we can offer that will move the needle in that direction?
I think it's important to have them involved in the steps. So I wasn't saying I totally agree that we should have them. The more along the ride they are, the better. But I also think we just need to make sure that we all keep our thinking caps on. That's it.
I think a measurable that we should have is a code update to enable council at its discretion to allow densities lower than 3.
yeah,
And we can work out the game plan of how we,
of what exactly the number is. And
That's
where.
something we need to do.
Yep.
100%.
Give us the ability to do it. So
That's what
that
we were
if
aiming
it comes
for
up, we can.
in that meeting, is exactly what you're saying. I don't know if we'll get discretion, but the code flexibility to do that. Because we can't say you can do one, but no one else, like,
Yeah, we don't want it to get where we're, okay, we figured out there's a way we can do it, but the only thing preventing it is our city codes, it can't be less
Yeah,
than.
that's,
Well, and maybe we do it in a way where it's only allowed under PUD for now, just as a short-term thing.
Figure it out. Figure it out.
As we figure out how the system needs to get structured, so we don't end up with the opposite of what we
It
want.
almost would have to be by default because you couldn't. Well, no, it wouldn't. Never mind.
How are we gonna get developers to come in and propose developments less than 3 units per acre when
Well,
they're paying the
we
money they're
have
paying?
we have standards.
I know, I'm just saying.
I don't know that we
everybody-
will on a large scale, but I think
Well, I think so. It depends on the property, right? So the Pulte piece down in the southeast corner would have came in under 3 without townhomes,
yeah, that's true.
you know? It's probably same with Tavera, probably would have came in under 3 without townhomes or twin homes.
But they wouldn't build it without that.
Well, now they can't
Because
do
of the
it.
cost.
Yeah.
To build something.
We were sort of had our hands tied because our code had certain requirements. And
Right.
if we eliminate that requirement and they come in with a PUD and we just don't, we don't like it, we can just say no.
We can say,
We have the ability to say no.
Yep.
And if a builder wants to replicate Maple Grove all over Corcoran, we would be able to say, go build in Dayton.
go build someplace
It would
else.
also unlock the ability of, I just use this as an example, like, you look at the kind of 4 or 5 lots to the north of 66 there on Ravinia on 101. Like, let's say in the next 20 years, though, someone buys all those up and wants to do a small 4-house development on that property.
Right.
You could do that, right now you can't. And actually, it would still be more dense than, if there's more than one house that's already existing there, going in to be more density, so I don't know why my council would have an issue with it in the first place.
Or we could have our code have along major corridors, it's one house per acre. We're not gonna do this, but hypothetically, we could change so the corridors don't look so packed and you have to, inside the corridors, you have to have a higher density. Or outside, right next to the corridors, you could have a lower density requirement or something like that, so like,
Mix it up.
yeah, so it doesn't have the feel of,
Well, another property would be just like up where, right next to the memory care off 10, right? There's a vacant lot there. They came in to meet density. They came in with row homes.
yeah,
Or, yeah, someone came in.
Right.
I think we'd have trouble putting
No, but I mean,
estates
if
there.
you came in with less than 3, you could come in with homes that would have matched the
The
existing
existing.
neighborhood
Yeah,
to the west.
totally true.
That's true.
The M&I stuff.
Right.
Yeah. It just gives us so
Yeah,
much
it's doing
more
something,
flexibility.
some code update to allow flexibility there.
So just looking at the next core strategy, I think that the two that we talked about developing park standards and an update on park funding sources. So we talked about Park Development Fund, potential grants, but there's some other potential sources with some of these other partnerships. We even talked federal. It would be good for us to roll all of our potential parks and trail sources into one. Both of those might roll onto the next core strategy. So I'm going to hold off on those for a second. So what I have for a measurable is we have to update the map. We have to follow through on that, which didn't happen from 2023.
Can I just, there is an update, we did do that map with snow and ice policy.
Okay.
So that was done, I think, late December, so it wasn't on this update, but there is a map pulled together.
Okay.
But that's existing trails, right?
It's existing trails and easements, so it's just like chunky all over the city.
Oh, so it
but
shows easements
that was
that
what
aren't
the, yeah, so it was an
Yeah,
update.
so
not
this one
in the-
says future trails was
Oh,
the goal.
future trails.
Yeah,
Okay,
the
sorry.
goal
But
is
at least
future
that'd be a
trails.
good baseline to
Start,
make
right.
that
Yeah,
off of.
so-
Yeah,
Because if you cover the easements of properties that we have, where there's
Right.
no
Yeah.
trail.
that's a lot of it.
And I'll add as the measurable, a code update to add at the discretion to potentially allow density lower than 3. And You've been part of those discussions, so we can work towards that. Are there any other, that will be the measurable goal added to core strategy number 1. Are there any other measurable goals from core strategy 1? Other discussion?
That covers a lot.
The Met Council 101, I'm not going to add as a measurable because we were talking about doing that anyways. So we'll just go forward with that as part of normal course as a joint meeting.
Does that measurable though fit with the strategic objectives of number one?
A core sense of place and identity, but with the objectives, you might be onto something there. It's not tied to events. A place where people can identify with.
Yeah. It's more aligned to the 1, 2, 3, 4th of core strategy objectives.
So the high quality market-driven growth.
Market-driven
one?
growth.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, that makes
I
sense.
can add it there.
No, that works.
So do we have any other additions to core strategy 1 other than,
I think the sense of place one does still tie off to some kind of park development target. Whether that's the Bellwether Park, whether it's the Ravinia Open Space Park, whether it's City Park. Maybe we keep it general until we get more detail.
well, we received a proposal from HKGI, and so we'll be discussing that on moving forward with the city park plan. And so coming forward with plans, deliverable plans, that could be a measurable next step.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good one. And I'd like to get the Bellwether boardwalk on there, something measurable, just because I feel like it's not gonna be incredibly tedious or a ton of work once we get past the couple holdups that there are. It's not a extremely complex project. It's just needing to hammer out a few things with the developer. So I think it's, in terms of workload, we can handle it along with City Park if we just make sure to not put it on the back burner again.
Any feedback on that, Kevin?
I think that's what we were marching towards with City Park and Boardwalk when we selected HKGI as the 2 priority
Mhm.
projects. So that's kind of how we're marching right now. So I'd like, we're just kind of reaffirming our process. So they're both in the queue. Just the Boardwalk and the City Park. So if you're talking like planning the OS&P Park up in Bellwether or the actual park in Bellwether, the neighborhood park, if you want to include that, that's not in our current kind of
I think we get,
implementation plan.
for me personally, I think we get that done first. And as we are working on City Park, then that could be a phase 2 of the
It's
next
a
project.
phased evolution on all
Yeah.
of these things. Yeah.
So what would you think about having a plan creation goal by the end of the year for the
For-
Bellwether Open Space and Bellwether City Park?
In the Ravinia open space or the Bellwether?
I was thinking Bellwether just because it's all in the same area, and if Hope comes through and they start going relatively quickly, there'll be a lot of demand for park amenities in that
Or is
area.
it maybe a more general, like a template that we use for our open space parks? I'd imagine,
You could potentially scale it out. Once you have one,
Yeah.
you may find
like
opportunities.
the
to-
neighborhood parks might be different based on surrounding community. A Ravinia versus a Bellwether versus City Park, whatever, but an open space park should be relatively consistent. So maybe it's a broader template on that.
And as they're developing the park standards, we could ask them specifically to address open space parks, which could provide that template.
Okay. Kevin?
I was just going to add, there is a distinction between the Ravinia Open Space Park, which has really nothing in it other than the trail stub. In the Bellwether Open Space Park, there are the trails that are prepped. They'll be paved in the spring. They got prepped late this fall, so there's 4 points of connection, and one of those is the boardwalk. So as part of that development, there will be bituminous trails next spring built through there. So there is a distinction between those 2 open space parks and how they evolve
Yeah,
through the
gotcha.
development process. So if you put I would just maybe broadly say open space park, because you could pick, there's, I think you could hit both of them with the same kind of conversation, to Jay's point.
Yep, perfect.
Excellent.
So we'll add open space park plan or
Design,
standards
yeah.
to the scope of the standards.
That works.
Okay, so what I took away as measurables for core strategy 1 is the future trails map, and then now the plans for City Park and the Bellwether Boardwalk as the second measurable. Any other comments on core strategy 1?
It's not just the boardwalk though, right? It's just a straight open space park plan in general?
So the open space park plan, I was going to add to the develop park standards, which is going to get added to the core strategy 2, which we're about to.
Okay.
So we are going to have the open space park standards clarified as part of the process by the commission for developing park standards.
Okay.
Anything else on core strategy 1? Okay, going on to core strategy 2. Provide diverse community amenities and recreational opportunities. The objectives were plan for and provide multi-seasonal, multi-use trail and park systems. Provide high-quality parks that are unique, innovative, and accessible. And then the short-term goals were to develop a new approach for creating park standards, design a more rapidly construct dedicated park, and develop a trail maintenance plan. So I will move the develop for update park standards to include the open space park standards as 1. And then the second one related to funding sources for parks. We had a measurable, which we have achieved, hire an engineering consultant to assist in processes for park creation consultant. HKGI did respond to and win that proposal. You have meet with Parks and Trails Commission in a work session to outline park standards document. I think that would be a follow-up once they updated park standards with this new requirement, so a 2024 update. When would you like the park standards to be established so that they can provide an update? By second quarter with an update by the tail end of third quarter, would that be acceptable?
I think it'd be good to get the standards updated by the end of first quarter so that they can be used for any new projects that come in. There's kind of a short fuse on that one because once something is submitted, it's hard to impose new requirements when it comes before council.
Yeah.
So-
Only the term
so then
gets
the-
real close.
Yeah, so then the work session would come sometime in second quarter or third quarter, would that be acceptable?
Yeah,
The joint
at least
session that you mentioned potentially having? I don't know if one happened last year.
I think one did, but I think we need another follow-up post this. But yeah, to me, second or third quarter would work. And I think realistically, it's gonna have to be second quarter. I don't think we could get them done and get the work session and everything all done in first quarter.
End of Q2.
Yeah.
Okay. Trail maintenance plan. The update, staff met and provided feedback to incorporate in a final draft.
Kevin just had a physical reaction when you said those words.
Oh, what?
When you said trail maintenance plan, I just saw you kind of jump up.
I'm sorry, I didn't-
Thanks.
So
maybe it's just because I keep telling everyone every year that we're going to be taking on trails with developments. That's probably what the sigh is, because it's a frustration. We did have a draft, then the snow and ice policy, probably 2 months ago now, or a month and a half ago, we did kind of lay the bones for that. And then we had a conversation about kind of tweaking our approach to development to be a little more assertive, to make sure development phases get closed up so we can accept these trails faster. So that's kind of our marching orders. Maybe an affirmation of that goal would be good to disclose if that's something that you still want to do. Until we hear otherwise, we're still going to approach it that way.
Perfect.
We don't have it yet, so we have a draft, we're hovering, we just don't really have any trails to maintain yet of significant volume. So we're preparing, I say it every year, you guys are probably sick of me saying it, but
It's gonna
that's where we
happen
stand
soon.
right now. So I think we're well positioned on a plan, we just need to actually accept the trails and actually convert the developments into public trails, so then we can take ownership and do a little bit more. We're kind of stuck in limbo, so that's kind of an update on that.
Are you seeing any momentum from any of the developers around mobilizing in spring to clean up those items so that they can relinquish them?
I mean, limited. We have some more stuff to do. We had some, we've been sending out some letters to developers and had some action not pertaining to trails, but there will be a flurry of letters going out to everyone in scenarios where it's been a couple of years since they've done anything. So that is a goal for first quarter, to make sure that they get executed next year. So.
Yep, I think
What
it's
we
just
talked about a
keeping
couple
on that.
months ago.
I think we're on the right track with having to be more proactive with that policy.
Well, when would we begin making corrections ourselves at this point with the direction you've been given?
It would depend on the specific.
Yeah, each of them's a little bit different. Basically, generally the letters would say, provide us a plan by X dates and how you're gonna fix it, or else we have, if they don't comply or we don't like the plan, then we send another notice and take over. So with it being in the middle of winter, it's a good time to let them develop their plan, and if they don't execute it, then we execute for them. So we have the ability to say, this is past due, this is a reasonable timeline to correct the deficiencies. If they don't meet those timelines, then we can execute on the surety and complete the timeline. So our goal is to complete the timeline so that we take over the trails in '24 for the phases in all developments that are behind.
Okay. I'm happy with the end of this year. That's good. Thank you.
Can I propose changing that short-term goal then from develop to implement trail maintenance plan?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's because we're basically there. We just that's a good verbiage.
So under provide diverse community amenities and recreational opportunities, I'm gonna massage the language for short-term goal first. That's develop a new approach in creating park standards, and put update park development standards to include open space parks. And then the measurable goal will be that they present that to you sometime in the second quarter.
Great.
And then number 2 goal is to implement trail maintenance plan. Are there any other goals or desired measurables related to?
Does our trail maintenance plan include winter plowing?
We had a proposal in there, yes. I mean,
Is
we
it
would
a plus or
reaffirm it.
minus at this point yet?
Was-
Have
Well,
we
we're not
decided
really
that?
doing anything this year. No, we're kind of hovering. It's a plan that won't be implemented this year because we're
We
not.
might not need it this year. if it
Yeah,
stays like this.
have we approved a plowing plan, or have we approved a not plowing plan?
You've provided feedback on a plan that does include winter maintenance, but we haven't put it into play. It's deferred till next fall at the earliest, where we won't be maintaining any trails this winter.
Do we have a cost on that trail maintenance? Did we ever talk about that? How much it's
We
gonna
haven't
cost?
provided like X dollars per year or anything, if that's something you want us to bring back. It's more of a, where do you find value? Do you want us to do it on overtime? Do you prioritize trails with the first wave of winter maintenance? I think we had some trails in the second phase, or talked about identifying trails. So there'll be an opportunity to tweak that plan. We presented a plan that we mimicked off of Chanhassen. A lot of the data in there is blank because we don't have trails to fill in, but so we kind of set the template, set the conversation. We can resend that out to you guys if you want to dive into it and ask follow-up questions, but it's more of a set for how do we prioritize, where's the value.
I just don't want to have a goal to implement a plan we haven't approved yet,
Well,
or have any idea what the cost is.
and that's, I think, a good key is the cost aspect of it. We should really get an idea of what the cost to maintain per mile of trail is that we're taking on. Developers love to put trails in because they become city property, right? And they can forget about it. Now we've got a plan to maintain them. It's gonna come out of general fund, I'm assuming. And then we have to have a capital improvement plan to resurface these trails at some point. So how are we gonna long-term plan for that? We should really have an idea of what the expected cost is long-term in trails before we even think about taking them as part of a PUD.
I ran today in Minnetonka, and some trails were not paved and some were, and it was all fine.
And I think that's like what Alan's talked about before, is like, I think you've used the example of on Gleason, like maybe we pave one side, but not both sides.
Right, or we
But how would we
maintain,
decide which side we pay or plow?
well, we can figure that out.
Whoever pays the most in taxes?
But you can kind
Well, I mean, I
of,
don't know that it would matter.
just kidding.
Like I live on one side of it, and I don't know that I would feel any differently if,
We got
One
crosswalks
side
now,
was
you can
paved
get from
versus
one
the other.
side to the other.
I
and
get
get
it,
to the
but
side
you
that's.
could,
If you have
No.
a
could use that
policy-
one trail differently in the winter than
Right.
the other side,
Yeah.
right? Some people would use it for walking and some people would use it for snowshoeing or
Yep.
skiing or
Yeah,
whatever.
the crappiest policies
flood.
are
But-
ones left open to interpretation.
How many miles of trails are we gonna have that developers are gonna give us, and are we gonna
Yeah.
pay for them 10 years after the fact that developers come and gone?
Even the trail along along 19 is not maintained during the winter.
That's not ours.
I know, but there's a reason why they probably don't maintain it during the winter, because it would cost a ton.
Well, I think didn't they say we could maintain it in winter if we wanted to plow
Three
it?
Rivers lets us, they, at least at that time, give a really small compensation for it. And it's at the, I believe it's still at the discretion of the local to do that, you just have to. One of the concerns we get at the staff level is we start maintaining trails in one part of the town and not in another.
What are you gonna maintain it with anyways?
Joe Public would not maybe see the distinction, and they'll probably be asked to maintain that trail, even though it's Three Rivers, if it's even an option. So that's
Right.
one of the things that
Yeah.
we recognize that we want to be consistent everywhere, at least be transparent about why we're not doing a specific trail. And that's where, at least in that preliminary plan, it identified like priority areas or routes. Like, we're not going to be able to, we're growing too fast to keep up every single trail. Like, we want to set priorities, and I hear you in some of the comments made, but we also have to have some flexibility in our policies, or we won't be able to function efficiently either.
I think the way the
Like, we
policy
have
was
to trust
written
the-
was good in that we're not trying to add additional cost in overtime or hire more people or buy additional equipment beyond what we've already bought to be able to keep trails clear. It was a lower priority item. If you're between snowstorms and people have the time, they would use that time to plow with the equipment that we already have. I think that's a good optimization.
A, B, C, D
Yeah.
category, yeah.
Yeah,
We
but
really didn't have that broken out yet, but that's how we were proposing to navigate those, and so yearly, we could update which are the A trails and the B trails, and then depending on what category you're in, you got there either when it was as needed or as available, or if there's a priority trail, maybe city center sidewalk's a priority because of proximity to city park, and, it's like there might be, over time, there might be key areas where we feel like it
Yeah,
should
we'll learn
be,
where those
it
are
should
over
be
time.
maybe on the A route versus the B route, but, so we try to create slots, for lack of a better word, and bracket things as we learn and evolve. I anticipate every year that we revisit that conversation, we'll yo-yo a little bit until we kind of settle in on an approach that works, that satisfies our users and satisfies our budget and our taxpayers. So we're gonna yo-yo a little bit as we figure that out. We're not gonna be able to control when certain trails come on. So at least for the time being, we're gonna have to be a little more flexible in our policies and know that we're gonna have to adjust them on a frequent basis. Like every year, let's have a conversation about what worked, what didn't work last year, what we expect to come on and how we wanna change it. That's the only realistic approach we have, if I'm being honest. We're not gonna be able to predict what's coming in that
I
year.
think if we could, if you could send the draft policy back out, I think that'd be helpful for us to just take another look at. It's been a little bit since I've taken a look at
So
it.
as a city, if somebody came to me, I'm just hypothetically, if somebody came to me and said, hey, our trail isn't plowed out, I'm like, well, we don't plow with trails. Oh, okay. But then, and that's easy. It's easy to explain. But if somebody called and like last year we got 100 inches of snow here. Somebody calls and they said, hey, my trail didn't get plowed out. Oh, where are you? Oh, I'm here. Oh, you're on the C set of trails. We only plow those trails out if we haven't had snow in like 2 weeks and no one's got anything better to do than to plow out your trail. Like, we have to be careful about getting a spider web of BS and word salad to decide which trails get plowed. unless, Jay, you want to take calls from residents asking all winter long why their sidewalk, or not, why the trail behind their house isn't plowed out. We're setting ourselves up for a bad outcome if we don't have something really easy to read and articulated on the front end of the trail plowing policy.
You just brought up a great example too. So last year, coming on the heels of a year that was not like that, coming from a city that had 77 miles of trails, and the priority was when we had snow to get out there and we put people on trails, and we totally, to get to your point, blew our budget. Overtime was out the wazoo because they plow the roads first and then they get to the trails, and so our budget was way over. So the decision was made as I was leaving Shakopee, there will be no trails done on overtime. But ironically this year, it's a non-issue.
Yeah.
So to your point about how do you budget for that, we're in Minnesota. Who would have expected that it's, January 2nd and we still don't really have any significant snow, or I guess January 3rd, sorry. But we still don't have any significant snow. The unpredictability of that and what the demand's going to be in terms of snowfall, ice is probably a bigger issue on trails than trying to do plow. Because, grandma was walking on here with her dog and she slipped and broke her hip, and I want to know why the city didn't salt that. And so there's a lot of potential liability as we take that on as well that we have to talk about. But budgeting is very, very difficult because the weather's unpredictable. And the more that you add, staffing is difficult. The equipment, so we do have some equipment that we've taken on or prepared to deal with this. But some of the spaces that are going to come on, how do you take care of a boardwalk? That's hard. Yeah. And once you create an expectation, to your point, it's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Once I've gone out there and it was clean, now forever and ever, amen, I expect that it's going to be clean. And if it's not, I'm going to call everybody.
Jay Tobin. That's who I'm going to call.
Never met him.
Over and over and over again.
Bottom of plowing service.
Yeah.
So staff has been working hard, and I've talked with those guys too, as Kevin said, trying to clarify. There's concerns about that because then also we have a lot of roads. We have limited staff and equipment, and how do you clarify expectations? We have to be clear, particularly for staff, so that they can answer those questions as they're plowing. Hey, are you going to come back and hit my trail? If a decision's been made, we're not going to use overtime for trails. Just be prepared. Trails you're never going to get to trails. That's because we're always going to have so much work to do. If we have a snowfall that's going to require us to call in plows, that's going to keep them occupied for a full day of work until they get to trails. Or we're going to need them to go get to sleep because we got no more snow coming in.
Yep. Yeah, we just, in Corcoran with the half the roads roughly gravel and half not. I mean, we are crazy diverse winter maintenance planning. We have graders and other things that help when the roads are icy. I mean, we're about as complex as you can get in Hennepin County in terms of responsibility, traffic, types of maintenance. Wind can still affect us a lot. It could not even be snowing and could have drifts that we have to go out and deal with. It's very fluid. So it's going to be hard to make a static plan. We can certainly talk about all those aspects of the plan, and you guys can have guidance in those policies, but it's going to be, truthfully, it's going to be really hard to have a static plan for a while. And we're going to evolve and we expect that. So that's just the reality. Like, if something's not working, let's have a conversation about it. Let's tweak it. Let's really talk about the pros and cons of each. And we expect it to be tweaked. Like I said, it's going to yo-yo all over the place for a while until we settle in on something. That's kind of staff's expectation.
I think either way it gets back to that the language change of implement the plan, and whether that's implementing it to be very minimal winter maintenance, or we're adjusting it, or a lot of winter maintenance. That's what we need to determine, but it's still implementing a plan.
I would agree with that. Implement will be finally deciding what our plan is for the fall of 24, spring of 25. I think that, I'm not scared of that word, but I do think it's there, the bones are there. If you want to, you should review it. and kind of watch what happens this winter, and, you know, good winter to pay attention to stuff, we'll do that too. But it's not, nothing's approved, we're not maintaining any trails, so it's a good year to pay attention to it, because we will next year.
Yeah.
Or, you know, in some capacity we will.
So I'll change that to implement, and Kevin will resend out the draft of the policy.
Perfect.
And then we can, at a future date, get some greater feedback and clarity on council's desire.
Sounds good.
So, good. Core strategy number three. I've skipped it, sorry. Maintain excellence and safety and security for our community. 2 objectives: promote public safety engagement with the community, and 2, maintain position as one of the safest cities in Minnesota. Short-term goals: evaluate road designations, pedestrian crossings, crosswalk standards to ensure pedestrian safety. 2, deploy automatic license plate readers for use by police public safety. 3, accelerate planning and action for fire rescue and first responder services. And then there were some measurables there. Host a work session to understand desires for pedestrian crossing, crosswalk standards by the end of second quarter. My understanding is that happened, and we've installed 2 crosswalks. Is that right, Kevin? Is it 2?
Yeah, there was 2 projects that we implemented.
And then a policy.
And we adopted a policy, so when a new development comes in, like this winter, we would be reviewing those trail crossings consistent with that policy. So if there was something that could be included with the development, it could be done with the development. That was one of the goals of the policy, to be more proactive and focused. So we have the tools now to be able to highlight some of those crossing issues.
Have we met the desires of the council on that goal for
I
road
think so.
designations and pedestrian crossings?
The 3 that were put in were
Okay.
nailed the target, I think.
Yeah.
So
2 in Ravinia and 1 in
Or yeah, 2.
Bellwether, right?
It was 2 separate, yeah,
Signs.
Bellwether Crossing at Elm was the RFFB, or I get the RFB, the push, the solar push. And then we did
Striping.
striping basically at Gleason Parkway, at those 2 main intersections by Wildflower Park.
Stripes and signs, both
Stripes
went
and
in.
signs, yeah,
Yep.
and
Got no.
technically, we could add some landscaping or something was part of the plan. I think we're just gonna evaluate and see that was all gonna just kind of incorporate into the maintenance budget, public general maintenance budget. Yeah, I think we're kind of, I've heard nothing but compliments, mostly from the Bellwether community, but I think that was a success.
Yeah, for sure.
So with the adopted policy, are you comfortable with me removing that goal? So the automatic license plate readers, the measurable was to create a financial deployment plan for automatic license plate readers.
I think we have a work session coming up to learn more about it.
Yeah, so what's been happening this year is there's actually been 2 moving factors that it relates to this. And I think as we had talked about, the conversation with council would be is, what does this look like and what would the funding look like if it's right for the city? And 2 of the moving factors have been funding. We've known that there was possibly state funding coming. As of, I haven't checked with finance, but as of December 26th, we should have received our allocation. We wanted that option available as the city considered, if the city considered rolling them out. And also legislatively, we've learned this last year and are kind of watching and tracking some implications legislatively on vehicle tracking and how that might apply to ALPR location data and things like that. So we'll get into a little bit more of the weeds of that when we have the work session on there, but we've been tracking a few other moving pieces, and so that, I think it's been prudent to delay bringing this forward, but it certainly is not lost on our radar, and we do have it on the calendar upcoming, so.
Very good.
So I'll massage the language of that measurable. We have a presentation coming up.
Yep.
And then the last measurable was complete 2 action steps within phase 1 of the fire service action plan. Any update on that, Matt?
Yeah, so we've done parts of a few of them, but I think that given, we did do a review of this a year ago of the action steps, but I think we need to probably have a council agenda topic where we're recapping all of this. The council did reaffirm the subcommittee, the mission, vision, values, along with the work plan. But I think in recalibrating that timing, or as we talk about the functions of accomplishing these and how we accomplish them, at what point we become technical as a city, at our involvement in the fire service, probably requires another conversation as we start getting to the smaller items in here are we can accomplish with our existing tasks, but as we start looking forward in order to accomplish some of the longer term planning and inspections and some of those things have personnel implications, which require technical, staff for technical implementation, which is beyond my scope of expertise, and that's where we get into the fire staffing position, which tends to get a little bit deprioritized as it competes with other more immediate or pressing needs within the city, because we have divisions that are struggling, so it makes sense that we need to help keep them afloat. It's hard to bring on the new responsibilities for us, so I think maybe just having that conversation about what are we really doing here and what's our intention would help, I guess, set the council's priorities when it comes to staffing, because I think as we get deeper into some of the bigger future-looking things, that if we want to accomplish some of the larger items 3-4 years from now, the planning on those things begins this year, next year, and so on. So I think that probably is on us to have a larger conversation of what does it mean to accomplish these. Again, we have accomplished parts of a couple of the steps, but I certainly don't think that I don't think this should be removed from any of the goals, and I think we need to kind of elevate and kind of recalibrate where we're at with how we're going to accomplish them.
I was going to suggest that we add another measurable around renegotiating the Rogers fire contract to focus more on call volume and less on property value. And maybe look at reorienting our boundaries or looking at alternate providers, because that amount continues to escalate year over year, and at some point it'll make more sense to do something different if we aren't already past that point.
Yep, I would agree with that, and I also think that we're seeing that even our West Suburban has now, the landscape of our, the other third of our city is changing as well, that now it's not the Laredo Fire Department, they've merged with Hamel. What does that mean? What is their future? How does their future mesh with our future, and what does that look like? So I think it maybe even goes beyond the Rogers conversation.
I'm also curious whether Maple Grove might have changed their perspective on whether they would provide coverage in the future. I know they've never done it in the past.
I was gonna say, what led you to believe that?
They have not.
It's always worth asking the question.
Yeah.
Like when we're searching for providers in any circumstance, we just don't have, not asking, or asking is not a crime.
Yeah, fair enough.
And with respect to fire and public safety and medical here in Corcoran, I was a part of the original plan, and what I would like to do is that we hired somebody to come up with like a fire safety study originally, and then we had a committee that did the plan on a big picture level. What I want to do is, there's a lot more to the story than, I'll just give an example. Call volume is one that people cite a lot. What's the call volume? And then, and there's kind of some in the emergency responder world that think that there are calls that don't need to be acted upon for first responders to go, like lights and sirens, for example. Or some cities don't even have fire that responds to broken bones. Like, I work in some of those cities where if somebody calls and they have a broken bone, the fire department doesn't even come out. And because you really don't need the fire department to come out in a non-life-threatening emergency. Not saying we do that. There are also, like we have, for example, in our town, if something happened here tonight to one of us, we would either have the police department respond medically, or the fire department would probably show up too, and North Ambulance would show up as well. And we have this, in the fire study, you've all seen it, they have this whole gap in coverage, and it's like right here and sliding to the southeast. What I want to see done, and this is what I think we should do, is have conversations with Maple Grove, Rogers, Hanover, Loretto, and then even bigger picture people who understand the comprehensive network of emergency responders, including North Ambulance and Corcoran Police Department, and get some things on the table as to what we need to think about as a city. Because like what you're talking about today, you might be onto something. But there's a lot you don't know. A lot I don't know because I haven't looked at it. I think we oughta. What I would ask, I don't do planning commission. I'm not responsive to parks and trails. I don't go to those meetings. What I want to do is, because I'm actually involved in these, I want to look and interview and do in-depth analysis and discovery of what even our options are. What can we do here? All the way to something we haven't even thought about that somebody will bring to the table, what we respond to, and developing our own. What I think we should do is look into that in a in-depth, comprehensive way. I actually would like to do that myself and bring you back data, not a recommendation, but go and just under the umbrella of the city council, just bust my ass and try to figure out what's going on and what we have as options.
So one of the exercises that we did, John, when we was establishing service response standards, and we kind of, the approach that was taken was establishing the philosophy of here's the level of service that we want as it relates to medicals. And I hear you talking about more of the how we're going to accomplish it should drive the what do we want. And I think what we had done before is establish the what do we want, and then we will use the technical resources to meet our philosophical, what we had outlined. So do we need to revisit the service expectations that were outlined as we talked about our mission, our vision, our values, what we wanted from service, and then the plan was to use the strategy of our available resources to meet what those thresholds were.
So how I would look at the issue is, you do it concurrently, where if your standard is this, here are your options. If your standard is this, here are the options. Like, we use different standards. I think we developed a standard first and then the how. I think what we'd want to do is look at the variability in standard and what it would take to make the standard. Because as a city council, like, for example, we're not going to do this, but somebody could have a presentation and say, we want to have people on the scene in 3 minutes anytime anyone calls 911. And for anyone listening, that's super unrealistic.
Very.
But they would say, but then you'd say, okay, if you want this standard, you would need to have every square mile, you would need to station first responder. And even down to, like, they'd have to be an EMR or an EMT or whatever, or a medic. Like, to just come here with a presentation on, if you want this, this is what you need to achieve to get there. If you want this kind of coverage, here's what you kind of need to do it, including, like, one thing we never had in those discussions on fire when it came to medical is North Ambulance, which is the highest level of medical coverage we have in our area. And I happen to work there, but I'm a total grunt and an EMT. But, like, they've never been on a discussion about how to have medical coverage here in Corcoran. But I've had those conversations just casually, but we need to figure it out, and we need to figure it out before it becomes a problem. And it's not a problem yet. I think we handle things adequately, but what I would love to do is just go neck deep and just bring you guys the data and what's really things to think about on a ground level about how to handle.
And then what you think, maybe bring it to like a work session or maybe multiple work sessions?
I don't know, I think that would be at the discretion of the council, but there's so many moving parts that we all are after the same thing, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that I think that we should bring to the light, and I'd be glad to do it. It's my heart and soul that's part of my passion is I would be able to do it, but I'd be open to other options, but it would involve obviously Corcoran PD, the fire departments, and then North Ambulance to see, or even on our own, like what we could do as a city and like get really, I kind of be like a consultant, but I'd be like the lowest paid consultant. I'd just do a bunch of work and give you guys data and information with just because I happen to be on council. I think it would be awesome for me to be able to do that and bring that to you.
Can I think, this is what I heard you say, and I think it falls actually under what's already a goal. It's just adding a different measurable. Because what you're talking about is fire, rescue, and first responder services and planning, which is goal number 3. It's not accelerating planning, but that is it. But this is a different nuance of it. And what I hear you saying is, as a measurable, doing a needs and capabilities research study and coming back to the council to discuss. Is that?
Yeah.
Did I catch that?
So we had, in our previous conversation, set a functional response time standard of 15 minutes for medical coverage within the city, which was based on our previous calls for service and functional response. That was measured, as you remember, we started tracking that back in about the time we did the study, so it was 17 or 18.
Yeah.
And tracked that data, looked at what our response was, looked at what our expectations were, identified what functional response was, and set the target of meeting that functional response at 80%. Are we wanting to go back and revisit those standards that we had looked at in this previous study, as we're starting to talk about, to your point, the tactical, how are we meeting the standards as we're getting more?
I think I want to look at it, so I want to look at it a different way where, and think about it in a different way where, like if somebody breaks their leg and you get there in 25 minutes, for them it might be an extra 10 minutes, but for the health outcome of the patient, it doesn't matter. But if they are not breathing and you get there in 15 minutes, well, they're dead. So I want to kind of get into a little more of the details about, so you have 100 calls and the average call time, or time to patient is 13 minutes. That is not that's a good data set, but it's not a data set that offers you something to establish what the outcome of the patient is. I want to look at it a little more nuanced, where it's the patient outcome and the time that matters to them and whether it matters, whether it makes a difference. And so
So it might not be changing that 15-minute, but it might be breaking it down further within that.
Yeah.
I think that overall still might be 15 minutes.
How would you, my thought process around that is you're asking the 911 operator then to triage the response times, right? Wouldn't you essentially be that?
So
Say,
that's-
what's wrong with you? And
That happens to a degree already, so for instance.
They do
if
it
it's-
now.
If it's
Yep.
a broken, if it's a non-emergent call,
Yeah.
each, the responding entity, so we don't, if we're responding to an unknown medical, for instance, our officers arrive, find out it's non-emergency, they'll downgrade fire or ambulance to a routine response. And depending on what it is, if it's one feeling ill, people aren't going lights and sirens. If it's, but if it's a possible stroke, so it really does, they're response does depend on the symptoms and to a degree is triaged, and that 15-minute response was for emergency, not measuring the non-emergency versus emergency responses. And I guess my focus for the council would be really asking from a policy level, what are the service expectations for the community? And we can talk about how do we meet them, or what's the best way to meet them as far as the best value. It starts getting, when you start bringing an ambulance person in there, which we've had conversations, the ambulance wasn't at our fire service planning because it's to a large degree out of our control. We have some pressure that we can place on them or requests, but they're, you know, who we had at our table for our fire service planning was our 3 fire chiefs, John and Brian Dejewski, looking at what are the community expectations. So it's really a matter in my
Yeah, but
mind
I think that was a mistake not having them there, because it actually turns out that we do have some control about that. I didn't know it at the time, but I've talked to people at North and they're like, I don't know why we weren't at those conversations. But maybe you've had different conversations with North on your level. But when I say I'm on city council, we're doing this, they say, well, here's what, we should talk about this, and, you know, it's just now in hindsight, it seems strange that in a medical conversation, we wouldn't have the people who are the medical providers to our area as part of that discussion.
Yep. Shannon Galnick was the director at the time. I think we've gone through 2 of them for our region since then.
Sure, we should.
And we had talked with them, and that was, yeah, they had opted to not, this was outside of the scope of what they were looking at the time.
That's changed.
But it's
Yeah,
changed twice.
Well, get them
Harm in getting into the same
and
room.
invite Maple Grove to the table. We've got some needs, and open up that communication again.
All I'm saying is, let me dig into the issues.
Yep.
Let me bring the parties together.
Worst
You
case
guys are all
scenario,
analytical and smart, so I would just say, here's what I found out. Let's see what we can do with it.
If
That's what I
there's-
do as a living, is bring data to people
If
to
there's
analyze it.
information you need help with, Elena works.
Yeah, I don't know.
911 dispatch, she can get you information too, for Hennepin County.
There's a lot out there, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't put a
Yep.
ton of effort into what we already have, but also the stuff we don't even know and the stuff we need to think about.
So maybe it's reviewing and potentially reassessing some of that plan, or more so just making sure we've all been up to date on it, adding in whatever new information we find, and making sure we revisit that plan in, I don't know, quarter by quarter 3. I think we'll be able to get some of that.
I'd like to start with maybe if we can, the existing subcommittee recommendations to figure out what are we re-examining so that we're intentional about what's good that we're moving forward with and what are we redoing or recalibrating so that we're not working in a parallel lane to the work we already did or replicating work, and that we're identifying what's still good data versus we want to look at different data. So
How long ago was that done, Matt?
the subcommittee recommendations were finished in 19. Things paused with COVID in 20. The first draft of the work plan came out in 21.
Okay.
21, 22 was the first draft of the work plan for the achievables out of the recommendations. The recommendations were directly a result of the ESCI study. So if you're going way back, for those of you that were in the council, the ESCI study was saying it was intended to be a comprehensive growth plan, fire service comprehensive growth plan for the community. We brought in ESCI, they evaluated it, and they said, well, because we said, well, how do we grow a shared service model? A lot of the focus in the fire service was combining services, but nobody had a good model for expanding the way our community is growing. What the consultants came out of that was with more questions, saying, well, we can't tell you how you need to grow because you haven't said what success looks like. You haven't told us what your benchmarks are for, for fire, for medical, for, what is your city's vision for service? And we said, well, we like our service now. And they said, but you have 3 different fire departments. You need to get some commonality on what those expectations were. And so every section of the Corcoran Fire Subcommittee recommendation were rooted in the same sections that were accomplished or that were examined in ESCI, how they evaluate fire services. So the analysis was done through the lens of prevention, protection, preparedness, ability to reach all residents, training, community education, response times, and then in response times there were subsets of fire and medical, and then what's our supporting data. So as we looked at each one of those sections, we said, what does this mean for Corcoran? So prior to that, we zoomed out and said, if we're going to analyze those, we have to decide what level of service are we intending to provide at, above, below industry standards, who's deciding what that is. So for that reason, we established the mission, vision, values. Here's philosophically where we want to be. Now let's apply that to education. Here's what it looks like in education. We're going to do X, Y, Z. Here's what it means for inspections. We're going to do X, Y, Z. Here's what we're going to do in meeting those are what were then extracted and put into the work plan for the checklist. So if we're going to re-examine, for instance, medical response was based on, to back up, we started collecting response time data on functional responses at the beginning of this group because we said dispatch response times doesn't count. That's not what we're looking at because every fire department measures that differently. Established a meaning of what is functional response time for each department, had a common operating term that they're using to time their responses so that we're getting good data. And that's the data we've been tracking since early 19 to say where are we at and are we seeing shifts in our availability and our response. So if we're going to recalibrate one vein of that, we might say, John says, I want to look at medicals. Okay, we're going to reopen the medical part of response times or the community service, but are we going to reopen education, training, these other parts of it? If we're going to start changing that, we should probably holistically look at it and not replicate or and also check that we're still getting the right data, the relevant data, and are the tactics that we're pursuing or our options on the table the right options. So typically, since I've started, about every 2 years, we'll have the phone call with Maple Grove. It's usually a really short phone call, but they're good partners when we need them, but they're also not at the times weren't.
I agree with you, they're not gonna do it. When I say we should call them, it doesn't mean that I think we're gonna get anything but not interested.
It certainly doesn't hurt to have a conversation.
What I would say, Matt, is is that everything is a part of the look at and reevaluate. There's a ton of stuff like inspections isn't something that necessarily is going to change. I think we just want to look at it from the very top of mind things that we've talked about since Jeremy and you guys are the newest guys, so like since you guys have come on council, has been fire response and medical response. We talked about it in city council probably 10 times. And we haven't talked about fire inspections but twice or something like that. So like the stuff that is an ongoing issue, we need to look at it not from a national standard or a state standard or whatnot. Even there is some debate into national standards like I talked about before, the standard time of response is irrelevant depending upon what kind of response you're after too. So like I think the whole thing should be looked at and have some data to ascertain what our best next option is. And I don't even know what it is. I'm saying that we need to have the data and put a lot of thought into it, and nothing would undermine what we did in 2019 because I'm not even talking about getting rid of anything from 2019. I think we just need to, if we're looking at it and going to exercise some of the options in that plan, we got to look at it again and really analyze the options and what we're talking about. And so I think everything should be on the table, since this is a critical year in doing it, because we have so many new houses and stuff, and the senior home. We ought to look at the medical stuff. What are we gonna do for coverage there?
So maybe it's a Q3 review with some additional data that, John, you work on kind of trying to put together to bring to council, and then we have a work session to just go over, might not change anything. It might be looking at what additional things we can add to supplement, or maybe we do decide to change some standards, but it's just making sure that we've taken a review. Like you said, we kind of took a pause with COVID years and haven't been as proactive as probably we initially thought we were. We were initially when the plan came out. And then can kind of figure it out from there, especially as we're getting into future years budgeting, we're looking at next year. And if we're talking about adding a fire position for 25, or, you know, as we're getting into that, that should probably be part of that same conversation.
So if this is acceptable, we currently have, it's listed as goal number 3. I'd like to change that from accelerate to just call that intentional planning and action for fire rescue and first responder. We already have one measurable that was tied with completing action steps of the fire service action plan, and add another measurable about reviewing and reassessing the action plan in the third quarter.
Sounds good.
Does the combination of Loretto and Hamel affect us?
We're not
Not really,
noticeably
no.
yet.
They did some analysis during the ESCI study of response times, and they said, they also looked at, was there value in the city re-examining a contractual relationship to Hamel, and it was marginal based on the response times and the ranges that, we can look at as the crow flies where it's at, and it seems common sense wise that it looks closer to some areas, but when you add in the railroad tracks and some of the other response factors, it did not have a substantial effect from what they found in doing the study. So them combining, I think it adds maybe breadth and depth to their staffing and equipment and maybe resources. I don't know that it substantially impacts, for instance, insurance ratings or the substantive factors that our city needs for fire service growth.
What about a short-term goal of restarting the K-9 program?
I know we've talked a little bit about just how that looks in the future, and I think first step would be having a process identifying a qualified and interested person, officer to do that. But I would like to continue it too once we have that sorted out, and I don't know, it's kind of hard to predict just with.
Is that something you want, Matt?
I think it's really good to have this conversation because there's also the chicken and egg effect. We don't want to try and get it going in the police department if there's not the political desire to have it, but knowing that there's a political desire from the council saying this is something that we think is good for our community based on what we've seen, based on our knowledge, I think is something that we can start exploring within the department. We have not had any conversations with staff about is there interest, is there qualified individuals, what does this look like operationally right now? So I don't know if it's feasible with our existing staff because as you guys know, the demands of that are very intense. You need more than just a desire, you have to have a passion that's going to be lasting for a few years. So certainly one of those programs that you have to be very cautious not to rush into or have a misstep on. But I think when it's done correctly, I think we've seen a lot of the value of having it. So I think if there's direction from the council to explore that, I don't know if you guys want to raise it to the level of strategic objective, because I think it is also dependent on what do we have for people resources that could be the right fit for it.
I think it's something that we definitely want to keep in mind, because I would like to continue it to whatever extent. I know there may be some analysis we should do on if we were to get a new K-9, do we have a dual train like Zeke was, or do we focus it on one or the other? And I'm sure you could talk a lot more on that.
There's other things too related to K-9. I'd love it, but the implications that are coming out of some of the non-prosecutions related to if you've got a canine that only looks for the narcotics that are of concerns now. If an attorney says, are they also trained in the marijuana side of things? Yes, then it was an illegal search. A lot of the knockdown, what is it called? Matt, you can help me out on, you can send Zeke out to go after somebody, and if there's a bite, there's a lawsuit involved. I mean, there's a lot of things that
We
have
talked
changed
about
over
that when we
canine.
started the
Right.
K-9 program, is the lawsuit stuff. But I share we talked about, like, do arrests lead to convictions? And, you could almost make the argument in Hennepin County that we don't even need a police department because they don't convict anyone on anything in this county.
Yes.
What's the point?
But again, the canine has gotten to be a very specific position, I'm gonna call it, because they are officers and stuff. There's only so much they can contribute to, even though everything they do is helping our police officers do their job, so.
There are some, I guess, guaranteed benefits that if you look at, for instance, tracking, that you have a person that wanders off with dementia or a lost child, that it gives you an immediate place to start. They can do article searches if you believe something, a weapon or a piece of evidence was thrown. So, I mean, doing some of those searching things are fairly universal. When you talk about whether or not to have one that's trained in apprehension, the pluses and minuses of that. The narcotics, obviously, if we did training with drugs right now, they would be trained, not to alert on marijuana. They would be trained
Right,
to.
that's what I'm saying.
And I think, part of the step was that our city ordinance did make it a crime for possession of paraphernalia for the still illegal drugs, which would help with preventing the invalidation of some searches.
Just for the record, marijuana is still illegal as a federal law.
I understand that too, but.
So, to your point, those are all points of consideration, and I think, if you want to get into the technical components of them, I can talk at a high level at what they mean organizationally and policy-wise, but I also know the trainer that we've used in the past, McDonough, is more than open to having either one-on-one conversations or group conversations. If you want to get into that more detailed analysis, he's, very up to speed on case law, on trainings, but it is demanding for those officers to know the ins and outs, what's legal, what's appropriate in what scenarios. Lawsuits are a potential in everything that we do in law enforcement, and there is certainly risk if you're doing apprehension with the dog, and I think that analysis has to happen on an ongoing and case-by-case basis of what's your risk and what's the need to apprehend this subject in this instance.
I'm almost thinking maybe that whether it's a short term or a measurable is we set a date to make sure to have you follow up with the council on where we are staffing wise. If in 6 months do we have someone that
Someone
might
interested,
be
yeah.
on the path to being interested and able to do that, or do we realize that nope, not with our current staff, we don't have that person, maybe in the next year we will, and we can kind of reevaluate from there.
I think it would also be good, as you're conducting that analysis, does it make a difference if the dog has to be dual trained? Would people be interested in doing it if the dog is only for search and rescue or search and seizure
Can I
versus
ask
apprehending?
a quick philosophical clarification as the newest guy in the room here? So I wasn't here when we had a canine, and I came from a community that had a lot of crimes and wasn't operating with a canine. What is pretty clear to me is canines are expensive, and it's also pretty clear to me that the optics of it are really positive. But in talking with Matt, a lot of the work that it did wasn't actually in the community of Corcoran. And so when we look at the expenses of a canine, the trade-off is that, for example, this year we didn't bring our communications person on board full-time. And as a result, we can't really do some of the website stuff that we need and some of the other communications things. So the cost of that, if we want to maintain a flat tax rate, is that we aren't going to be able to provide some of the other services that we want. So I just want to clarify that canine is that kind of
I'd tell you, the communications person doesn't protect my neighbor's home.
Okay.
So in a city where we have a very limited staff on at any given time, any weapon we can put in the hands of law enforcement to better protect our community is an investment, in my mind. That's better than adding staff in other areas of the city. I mean, I don't mean to put more work on you guys in other areas, but when it comes down to it, if my neighbor's house, if somebody breaks into my neighbor's house and they're sitting in there, and the perpetrator's out in the yard, we can use a canine to get them.
I think there's
Well, how often do we actually use a canine to protect somebody's house?
Well, I'm just saying, that's probably not a great example, but to his point about most of our canines being used outside the community, most of our crime is coming from outside the community too.
Yeah, I think that, yeah.
I'm not as worried about well, I mean, they're certainly not cheap. But I know, Matt, when you and I were kind of just throwing out ideas of how to potentially fund that in the future, there are routes and different funding sources that are out there in terms of, I think you mentioned a grant, that might be a possibility, and some of the state allocated funds, and some stuff that's specifically earmarked for public safety that we could utilize to fund the canine and potentially the training of an
Yeah.
officer.
So a lot to kind of touch on a couple of them. So about 45% of Zeke's deployments were in Corcoran, but that also doesn't count how many times we deployed other dogs in our city when we weren't using it. So I think that was part of the conversation, was recognizing that as a regional asset, we're using other people's regional assets and we're contributing to that pool. As far as availability, there is training costs that go into it, but the day-to-day upkeep was incorporated into the officer's regular schedule for the canine care and maintenance, previously for the management of it. Now, the program startup, there's the cost of the dog. There are grant opportunities. I think there's one out there, approximately $7,000, and there is also potential for some public safety state funds if we were looking at funding the initial startup and training. As it relates to the capital equipment, we have a canine squad that's been worked into kind of our capital rotation, that we have a fully functional and upfitted canine squad. So I think the carrying costs would really be related to that initial program and startup. And there is the training. We lose that officer for time from the streets if he has to go for the canine qualifications. We would lose an officer from the streets if they went to that canine school for the duration of their canine training. So there is a loss to the city with their absence, but it is currently built into how our police department's current operations are happening. So,
And to clarify, I'm not anti-canine. I'm just wanting to communicate, like, anytime that we're making decisions about other services, we made decisions that we didn't go forward with certain positions and services this year in order to maintain the budget constraints. And so now, if this is not projected right now in what I'm looking at for budget 2025, there will be trade-offs. And so I just want to make sure I'm clear on what the council's priorities are. That was my question.
So to that point, for one, we're the safest city in Minnesota right now. So like if we did it with the canine, so if you think about it from an organizational perspective, pretend we fall to number 4 and we got rid of the canine and we fell to number 4. People would say, oh, they're not allocating enough resources to the police department, which, whatever, you can read into that however you want. But like, what I think about is not whether the canine goes to calls, none of that matters if it isn't an effective actual utilization of the canine for crime prevention. If it's just like the canine goes and contributes to an arrest of somebody and the next day they're right back at their own, wherever they were yesterday before they got apprehended, it's not a good use of resources. So what I think is that you need to evaluate that as the city administrator, effective utilization of the resources underneath you. And if you made a compelling argument that a canine isn't, I'm open to hearing that it's not a good use of time and it doesn't contribute to the city as much as somebody in communications. I mean, like, that's your job, you know, and that a priority of our council is, like, we like to be safe. So you're gonna have to juggle that with whatever you might have as a priority of the city too. And I'm not anti-canine either, and I'm not anti-city administrator. I kind of would love to hear about what we're, with the give and take about that conversation. It's not to me as simple as like if we wanted to buy a tank. Well, let's buy a tank, then we can just run through people's houses or whatever. Like, just because it happens to fall under the guise of the police department or public safety doesn't necessarily mean it automatically should be on top of any budget consideration. Even though I think it's important, but there is a give and take with everything.
We need number one, we need somebody interested in
Yeah,
doing
that's gonna
that.
drive everything.
And it needs to be somebody that is intending to be here long-term. We don't wanna go through what we went through with Zeke. That wasn't fair to him.
I kind of don't want to set it as a short-term goal because I don't want to push that we force
An
that
officer to
too
do it.
early. I'd rather it be, we have the person, whether it's someone in the department now or someone that we hire in the next year or 2 years or whatever, that's the person that really wants it and it's going to be the right fit. So I'm less concerned about we have to have it up and running again in 2024 than I am. I'd like to look at it again sometime in the future when the fit is right. If that makes sense.
Do we have the numbers on events Zeke was involved in, the arrests,
Yeah, we got that.
everything like
We
that?
got that in our
We got that in our
packet.
packet. didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of it's hard to fully measure.
There's a lot of quantification
Yeah.
there that makes it a lot of judgment.
But-
I was proud of
For sure.
what we had.
For sure,
And what was started 7, 8 years ago. That was a great deal, and the private entities that started that means a lot to them and meant a lot to our city and such. It just, to go onward, I don't know if I want to rely on public-private funds going forward, grants, those kind of things. It almost needs to be part of a budget, but the gating item is having an officer that is going to be that.
And maybe that
It's our
person,
canine department.
that person can help, if they're identified, they could help drive us in the direction of, do we look at a dual training? What are their thoughts on it? Presumably it's someone that's interested in that type of role. They have some insight on it. So maybe that leads us to a decision point at that time, as opposed to trying to dictate it now. So,
That's all.
okay.
So the
Good
next-
conversation, you guys.
Next core strategy is ensure high-quality, market-driven growth. First objective was be innovative in molding market forces and organic growth in the community. Second was protect natural character, environmental features, and agricultural roots. Number 3 was preserve our distinguishing features through market-driven development. Number 4 was be responsive to the needs of businesses, both current and prospective. The first short-term goal was to review zoning around commercial and industrial and to consider types of land uses, buffers, and impacts. With the measurable being approve an ordinance update work plan related to underlining zoning for commercial and industrial land uses. Staff met with council and the PUD ordinance, that's the next one. Second goal was to finish the PUD project and the cookie cutter developments. Feedback was incorporated from the joint work session, and the PUD ordinance amendment was adopted in May. What we do have for certain was there's been a request to add a code update regarding the density level of 3. This is where that would go. And if there's any other,
The only other thing is the ongoing, which I think is kind of mentioned here, the ongoing, I guess it's commercial industrial that we've started. That wasn't too long ago, was it a couple months ago?
Yeah.
We initially looked at it, so it'd be maybe continuing work on that project. But we did accomplish a lot from this 2023 plan with the buffer ordinance and the PUD ordinance amendment. So I think we have those other two that kind of tackles the planning side of things.
I had one item here that I wanted to bring up for council to get feedback on. I think all of us were copied on an email from a resident about the difficulty of home occupations. And there were a number of things in that letter that I don't want to support, but I think it might be worth thinking about from a simple home occupations perspective. Is the code overly